Hi, my name's Dr. Katie McGettigan and I'm a lecturer in American Literature at Royal Holloway, University of London, and I'm talking to you today about Edith Wharton's The Age of Innocence. And what I'd like to talk about in Wharton's Age of Innocence today is what I'm going to call the anthropological gaze. And I'm going to explain that right now. So, when Wharton was writing The Age of Innocence in the early part of the 20th century, there was a real interest in anthropology. Now, anthropology is the study of human beings and their societies across time, in different places, in different cultures, in different environments. So anthropologists look at things like social structures in communities, they look at the kind of values that different societies have. And this is a field of social science that was developing in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century. It comes out of Darwin's interest in evolution. Once people started thinking about human beings as evolved, they started seeing the way that humans live and their societies as something that could be studied. And it wasn't just people in universities that were studying anthropology, it was a subject of popular interest as well. So people like Wharton, who were well-read, well-educated, were interested in reading books about anthropology. And I think we can see that interest in anthropology in The Age of Innocence generally, and also in Newland Archer, who also shares the author's interest in anthropology. So, in The Age of Innocence, Wharton sets up New York City as a subject for anthropological study. Remember that she's writing the novel in the late 1910s, early 1920s, but she's writing about New York in the 1870s. And this idea is that she can look back and set up the city as a subject for an almost academic study. She's looking at it like an anthropologist might look at a culture in a distant land or in the past. And when she's thinking about what New York was like a little bit later in her life, after she writes The Age of Innocence, in 1933 in her autobiography called A Backward Glance, she writes, "What I could not guess was that this little low-studded rectangular New York," and she's talking about New York in the 1870s there, "would 50 years later be as much a vanished city as Atlantis or the lower layer of Troy." So what Wharton is saying here is that New York is like one of these distant cities. It's a subject that can be studied, that can be picked apart. And we also might want to think about the title, The Age of Innocence. She's setting up the period of time she's looking at as a kind of historical epoch, like the Bronze Age or the Iron Age. Hers is the Age of Innocence. So where do we see this language of anthropology creeping in to the Age of Innocence? Well, we see it when Wharton is talking about the society that she is portraying in the text. So I'm going to read quite a long quotation, but I'm going to go back over it and talk about it in detail. So this is the narrator and the narrator through the focalization of Archer, thinking about the social structures of upper-class New York. So, in reality, they all lived in a kind of hieroglyphic world, where the real thing was never said or done or even thought, but only represented by a set of arbitrary signs. As when Mrs. Welland, who knew exactly why Archer had pressed her to announce her daughter's engagement at the Beaufort ball, and had indeed expected him to do no less, yet felt obliged to simulate reluctance, and the air of having had her hand forced, quite as in the books on primitive man that people of advanced culture were beginning to read. The savage bride is dragged with shrieks from her parents' tent. So in this quotation, we can see that what Wharton is saying is that the social rituals of New York in the 1870s are in some ways as inexplicable, as distant as the social structures and the social rituals of so-called primitive societies. And I think Wharton is indeed putting that word primitive in inverted commas. She's using it ironically. She's asking us to think whether or not the society of New York that she's depicting is in fact advanced, or whether it's just as primitive as these societies that anthropologists are studying. So one more point to make about anthropology. Newland Archer thinks that he's a great anthropologist. He thinks that he can look at the society in which he lives and see right through it. He thinks he can see through its facades, he can pick up on all the meaningless social rituals and tear them apart. And he even has that really quite cruel moment, if you remember, where he thinks about his fiancée May Welland as like some kind of Kentucky cave fish that's evolved not to have any eyes, so she can't see what's going on. So he thinks that May can't see what's going on, but he can see really clearly because he's got this sort of scientific viewpoint. But at the end, if you remember, the novel reverses that absolutely. Newland, with all the eyes on him, when he realises that everybody has always known that he is passionately in love with Ellen, he becomes the subject of study. So again, I think Wharton's not only ironising the society that she's portraying, but she's also, I think, ironising Archer, saying that perhaps the people who think they can see most clearly, in fact themselves are the subject of everybody's attention.